Get your Chasing Cars sticker delivered to your door for free when you sign up to our new Chasing Cars newsletter, a monthly roundup of our best stories, videos and comparisons that's easy to share with your friends and family. Where can you get it? chasingcars.com.au/newsletter. I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is a detailed review of the GWM Ute. The GWM Ute, or Great Wall Ute, or Great Wall Cannon as it's known in some other markets, is a really interesting new entrant to the super popular auto 4x4 dual cab segment here in Australia. Why is it interesting? Well, not only does it actually look quite good in my subjective opinion, but it is really cheap compared to the established cars in this segment. Just like I asked in our review of the Haval Jolyon last week, the GWM Ute might be cheap for a reason. And in today's video, I'm gonna give you the truth about what the GWM Ute is actually like here in Australia on Australian roads. Now, the Ute segment as a whole is not that great. Most of them do the job, they have decent payload, they can tow, but as cars to actually drive on our roads, they usually feel fairly weakly attuned to our conditions. So perhaps it's not quite as tough for the GWM Ute to stand out compared to Haval's SUVs, which exist in really competitive spaces. But that doesn't matter. That's not going to cloud my opinion of this car. The GWM will be subject to exactly the same testing that we run for every review that we do here at Chasing Cars. Cheap or not, everything is put through a properly objective lens. But you do have to kind of start at that price, don't you? $35,490 drive away for a base model, $38,990 for the mid-spec car, and $41,990 for the top of the range Cannon X that gets all the goodies. And I'm going to be talking about which model you should consider most closely in today's video. Firstly, I'll go through the key specs of the GWM Ute and how it stacks up compared to key rivals. Then we'll jump in the interior, check that out, have a look at the tray, and then head out on the road to see how it handles our conditions here in Australia. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below the video. As I mentioned, I think the styling of the GWM Ute is actually quite pleasing. I think they've done a pretty good job of it. Certainly more attractive than a HiLux in my opinion. Now, the bonnet is on gas struts. I mean, that's unusual to say the least. And it opens up to reveal a pretty modest engine, I think you have to say. 2-litre diesel, turbo diesel, 4-cylinder, producing 120 kilowatts of power. That's 160 horsepower in the old money, 400 Newton meters of torque. So the torque isn't too bad, particularly for an engine of relatively limited displacement. But compared to most of the other Utes in this class, 2 litres is low displacement, and the durability of something like the 2.8 in the Toyota HiLux may appeal to you more. The other thing I think they could have done with the GWM Ute to really differentiate it from the rest of the pack would have been to give it a 6-cylinder engine, put it up there with the Amarok or something like that in terms of engine size. But they haven't, so this is what it's got. Now, to keep things simple, there's only 3 iterations of the GWM Ute. Most Utes, there's like 20, 30, 40 different variants available on the market. There's just 3 in this car, and that's because they're all dual cab 4x4 automatic gearbox. And GWM are very clear about who supplies the components for this car, probably to try and give it a bit more credibility. So the automatic, for example, that's from ZF. The transfer case is a Borg-Warner unit. The ESC on the car is Bosch, and they're upfront about all this stuff, trying to show that the sort of bits and bobs that go into this car are really no different from what would go into one of its rivals. But of course, the question is, how does it all come together? And we'll get to that when we take the Ute, as it's called, out for a drive. But what are the other vital specs for this car? Towing, brake towing is rated at 3 tons. Some rivals can do 3.5, but 3 tons isn't too bad. Payload is 1,050 kilos. Ground clearance on the vehicle, 232 millimeters, as you see it here, unladen. That dips to about 194 millimeters when you've got the full payload in the tub. Weighting depth, GWM don't publish one for this car, but the length at 5410 is on par or a little bit bigger than some of this vehicle's rivals, but it's well and truly a good fit for that popular size of dual cab here in Australia, going up against cars like the Ranger, the HiLux, the Navara, Triton, Amarok. but of course pitching in at a much lower price. Now, if that full-on statement wasn't enough to make clear that this isn't a sponsored review of the GWM Ute, I don't know what will be, but even a fully objective review has to admit that when you go and look at one of these vehicles in the showroom and you jump up into the cab, your first impression is, wow, like it is nicer in this thing than in many of this vehicle's rivals, which feels stuck in a previous generation or even the one before that in terms of interior design. Now, don't get me wrong, when you start to take a closer eye to some of the materials, some of the icons and typefaces and shapes used in here, you can tell that some of it is a bit of a parts bin special, or that somebody went and had a bit of a good time on Wish ordering interior components for this car. But by and large, it looks good and everything works pretty much the way you would expect it to. Now let's start with these seats, which are a big ticket item. These are the luxury leather seats, GWM calls them. The base car gets non-leather seats that are not as flash looking as this, basically. Now they are perforated. Unfortunately, they're not cooled, but you do get seat heating. There's only 6-way power adjustment for the driver. You don't get under thigh angle adjust. It's another mistake similar to Havel's SUVs. But at least the fixed position of the seat base in the GWM Ute is better than that in the Havel Jolyon we tested last week, for example. So this car is more comfortable. The seat itself is more plush. It's not that supportive on long journeys, but I'm comfortable enough. And there's a good range of adjustment fore and aft and whatnot. Now, speaking of adjustment, unlike the Jolyon, here in the GWM Ute, we actually do have reach adjustment for the steering wheel too, which is good. So this car is firmly in 2021. The steering wheel itself reminds me of a Jeep steering wheel, but that's okay. The shape is cool, it's leather wrapped, we've got paddle shifters for some reason, and then we have lots of shortcut keys as well. Now, these link to the driver display, they don't always make that much sense. Like, you've got to unlock the driver's display to change the trip computer or look at your media, and you've got to hold down the OK button for a few seconds, and then you can sort of tab through the different screens. But there's absolutely nothing to prompt you that that's what you have to do. And then, if you use the adaptive cruise control, you can't even access the trip computer at all. So that's totally bizarre. And that's one place where there's a big difference between the GWM Ute and something like a Ford Ranger or a Volkswagen Amarok, which have kind of got those basic electrical functions and technological functions just squared away. Now, similarly, here we've got this touchscreen 9-inch unit that's standard across the range, and we do at least have some shortcut keys down the bottom here for radio, media, phone, CarPlay, which is wired. We've got air conditioning, so getting around this screen is actually not too bad. Then we've got quick access to the car's safety systems. So this system is actually better than the one used by GWM and Havel in some of their other cars. Plus, we've got real climate control buttons down here, which is terrific. Some of them do just link to a touchscreen menu. Like if you press seat heating, it just takes you to like a convoluted menu with all sorts of functions for the car, but whatever, you can learn to live with it. We've also got wireless charging on this mid-spec car, which is cool. 2 fast charging USB ports as well. Then we've got this rather futuristic looking shifter down here. We've got drive modes. We've got controls for the low range. This car runs in all-wheel drive all the time. The rear wheels are driven all the time. The Borg-Warner transfer case sends drive to the front wheels when slip is detected. And that's precisely how it feels. Drive around a slippery corner, boot the throttle, you'll get rear end slip, but then the front wheels come to your assistance basically. But you can run in a dedicated full low. We've got an electric rear locker as well. That's, it's better than nothing. And in terms of practicality, 2.5 cup holders down here. We have another sliding element to the center console and a deep bin, plus the door bins can actually take a really big water bottle. Material quality too, pretty good. Soft materials, that's rare on the door for a Ute. Soft dash, soft pads where your leg rests. So really it feels more like an SUV than a Ute in here. Some of the beauty's skin deep, but other elements make you think that GWM have really thought about the interior on this car. That overwhelming sensation that GWM have actually really put their minds to this product continues here in the back seat, which is a lot better than on some other Utes. Starting off with space, for myself it's 6 foot, headroom, plenty of it. Legroom is the big ticket item, got heaps of legroom. Toe room is good too. Plus the backrest here is more angled than it is on some other utes, so you're not totally uncomfortable and sitting upright. I'd be quite happy to do a couple of hours back here, I reckon. Plus we've got air vents across the range. We've got these grab handles pretty much everywhere, as you'd hope. And we've got another powered USB port and a household power point here in the back. And that's a feature that I wish every car would have. Plus we've got a flip down armrest. Don't bother looking for any cup holders there, but at least the door bins are nice and big. The materials do regress to hard touch on the doors, but you do get armrest padding and stuff. But one little thing I wanted to point out is the roof lining in this car. We've got nice, normal, well-finished roof lining in the GWM Ute. If in future you jump into a new HiLux or you're considering that car in your test driving, just have a look at the epoxy roof lining when you're in the dealership. It makes that like fingers on a chalkboard sensation. This one's just normal. Someone thought about that and didn't just cheap out. Nice. All right, let's have a look at the tray. Here around the back of the GWM Ute, it's definitely a little more anonymous than from the front, which is probably this car's most handsome angle, though the side profile is all right too. What we find is chrome-plated release for the tray. It's actually assisted and damped, like another thing which you just wouldn't expect on a Ute at this price point, or at least I wouldn't. We do have a standard spray-in tray liner as well. You'll remember a few months ago, we reviewed the facelift HiLux just after it came out, and even that car in SR5, pretty expensive trim, still had a just bare tray that had been scratched to bejesus by about 5,000 kilometers of testing on that car. We also have a standard sports bar finished in, well, polished something, and that does go some way to making this car look a bit more legit, as do the 18-inch wheels. In fact, 18s are standard across the range, but the base model gets a bit more of a dowdy design than the mid-spec and the top-spec cars. In that tray itself, we've got measurements of 15-20mm square. There is some intrusion from those wheel arches, and it's certainly not as wide in the tray as something like an Amarok, but it's not too bad. And we've got 4 pretty clear tie-down points here in this tray. Now, sadly, I can't put a full load into the tray for you on camera today. Things are a little difficult with the situation here in Sydney where we do our work, but we are doing our very best. And I know that some of my colleagues out there have actually reported that the GWM Ute's laden ride and its performance under load is actually relatively acceptable. So that information is out there. Close up that damped tailgate and we can chat about the running costs of the GWM Ute. The GWM Ute is actually relatively cheap to run compared to many of this vehicle's rivals. However, you have to be a little bit careful when you're looking at things like the cap price servicing scheme on this vehicle, because the intervals are weird. A bit like some of the other things on this car, they're just not quite right, and they should have been refined a little bit further. So the first service on this car, for example, is due at 6 months and just 5,000 kilometers, which is really short. But then after that, the intervals go to a uniform 12 months or 10,000 kilometers, again on the shorter and less convenient end for a vehicle like this. And so that means that instead of our usual 5-year calculation we can give you, the best we can give you is 4.5 years of servicing on this car, and that's going to cost you $1,700. So the dollar figure is cheap, but you'll be running back and forth to the dealer to get this thing serviced more often than something like a Ranger or a HiLux, particularly if you do bigger Ks on the car, as many buyers here in Australia will do. But at least the warranty is very impressive. 7 years, unlimited kilometers, so that's only beaten by the likes of the Mitsubishi Triton, which you can pick up with a 10-year warranty basically all of the time. But it's certainly more generous than Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen, Nissan, etc., who all run with 5 years in this space. And then finally, fuel consumption, like all dual cabs really, the Cannon or the Ute is diesel only, and the auto in this car really optimizes the 2-litre engine to deliver about 10 litres per 100 Ks combined quite consistently. So with so many seemingly good, or at least at benchmark points about the GWM Ute, there must be a catch, right? Well, yes. I mean, in some ways there definitely are. I mean, we've already spoken about how some of the controls for things like the digital driver's display just don't work in an intuitive way in this interior. We've spoken about some of the, I guess, missing features compared to something like a very high-spec Ute at another manufacturer at pretty much double the price of this vehicle. We've spoken about the weird service intervals, but you know, when you get into this vehicle and drive it, most of the experience just makes you think, yeah, this is perfectly acceptable. This is par for the course for a dual cab, and in some ways a little bit better than some rivals. But for me, that's kind of enough. If the GWM Ute is competitive with its rivals, despite being a lot cheaper, that's good enough. This doesn't have to reinvent the dual cab segment. This doesn't have to beat the powertrain of an Amarok V6 or the chassis tune of a Ford Ranger. It just has to be okay, I reckon. And it is. So let's start with the engine. 2 litres, yeah, displacement is a bit down, I suppose, especially when you don't have the backing of something like the VW 2-litre commercial vehicles engine, which made the 4-cylinder Amarok more than acceptable before the V6 turned up in that car. But out here on the road, most of the time it gets along just fine. 120 kilowatts of power isn't huge, but 400 Newton meters is pretty standard for a Ute. Yeah, dropping back a little bit now, I suppose, but again, it's acceptable. And the good thing is they've gone and hooked up this engine to an 8-speed ZF torque converter automatic gearbox, and that gearbox is pretty darn smart, and it does a good job of disguising the relatively modest outputs of this engine. It also helps you out quite a lot by engine braking much more than something like a Toyota HiLux. So as you're going downhill, a HiLux will often just want to freewheel, basically, meaning you've got to work the brakes quite a lot. The GWM is smarter than that. It'll engine brake and just hold a gear, like right now, for example, so you don't have to ride the brakes anywhere near as much in this vehicle. And then upshifting, it tries really hard to keep this engine in its torque band of around 2,000 revs, 2 to 3,000 revs. However, the engine itself is really quite peaky, so if you're accelerating with sort of a steady throttle, you'll get this massive amount of torque, the full slab of 400 Newton meters, coming through at about 2,000 revs, and then it just lets off almost immediately. So driving the GWM Ute smoothly is a little bit of a challenge, something that has to be mastered. By and large though, I'd call the engine and gearbox on the GWM serviceable. Now the interesting thing is it is one of the rare Utes that runs in 4-wheel drive or all-wheel drive all of the time. It isn't all-wheel drive, it does have a proper transfer case, it does have 4-low. What it doesn't have is 2-high, and it doesn't have 4-high. Now if you run it in the eco drive mode, GWM does say that that is 2-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive. All the other modes are basically permanent 4-wheel drive, but with not much torque allocated to the front wheels. And effectively it drives like a rear-wheel drive Ute until there's sort of detectable slip. Sometimes that can be dramatic and you get a lot of drive being sent to the front wheels very quickly. Most of the time it's imperceptible. And then if for the slower and more serious stuff off-road, you do have 4-low, as I mentioned. All in all though, it ends up feeling quite seamless, and certainly the ability to drive on a sealed road in effectively 4-wheel drive is a pretty nice peace of mind. It's certainly better in the wet than most Utes which are in 2-high, unless you stop and you put them into 4-high, for example, and then you can't drive most of them in 4-high on sealed roads anyway. So I think the setup's actually not too bad. That's quite well thought out. Also well thought out is the fact we've got 4-wheel disc brakes. I know there is a segment of the community that would prefer drum brakes on the back for parking on hills and towing and whatnot, but certainly the GWM Ute stops pretty effectively, and there's good pedal feel as well through the brakes. Now the chassis is probably where I would suggest GWM can focus some improvements in future. Now it really isn't bad, it steers, it handles fine. It's just a little bit ponderous, and probably where some investment in local suspension and steering tuning would really help, because this car really isn't far off. I'd put it, fairly level with Tritons and Navaras in terms of dynamics. It's not that bad. There is daylight though between this and a Ranger or this and an Amarok in terms of handling and ride. The ride's not too bad. The rear end is actually less prone to shimmying and shuddering than most vehicles in this class. It's actually the front suspension which is a little abrupt as you hit a bump. It can actually make small bumps feel bigger than they are and harder edged than they are. but we do have quite a chunky Cooper Discoverer tyre here that also helps take the brunt of impacts. Now, the steering is too slow, I would say that, so you've really got to turn the wheel quite some distance before you start getting meaningful results at the front wheels. The stability control is by Bosch, as I mentioned, and it can be a little grabby though, and it's again a bit of a story like the safety systems on this car. Just the having of a certain thing is one thing, but it's the tuning which really sets it apart. Now, this car's got a ZF Auto, that's pretty good. It's got the Borg Warner transfer case, it's got the Bosch ESC, and then it's got all of the safety stuff, adaptive cruise, lane keep, blind spot. Having them is good, tuning them properly would have been better. So the stability kind of grabs in and out quite a lot, and it does have some work to do, because when you start pushing the GWM Ute harder, you find it's relatively low limits, and then the stability control's got to jump in. And then on that safety stuff, you know, we again have this problem GWM have as a company of tuning that follow too closely warning very sensitively, you know, too sensitively for the reality of city traffic. And then the lane keep assist, it's not so bad as it was on the Jolyon that I tested recently, but it still has this tendency of where it can pick up the center line and then drag you towards it, almost as if it's like, oh, I found a line, I should steer towards that line. And then if you've got a semi come in the other way or something, that can be slightly hair-raising. I found myself turning it off every time, but you do have to turn it off every time, and it's quite convoluted to do that through the screen with small touch targets and stuff. The 360-degree camera though is very cool, very crisp. The blind spot monitoring works okay as well. And it's quite refined, it's relatively quiet in here. The engine does make itself known, but you know, all in all, the driving experience has a few rough edges, but really, bring me a Ute that doesn't have a few rough edges. There are a couple of standouts, but there's nothing overwhelmingly amazing before you start spending six figures on the big yank tanks. So those are my views on the GWM Ute, a vehicle which personally I would feel a lot more comfortable buying in the knowledge that it does have a 7-year warranty, which is very impressive no matter how you look at it. Yes, the GWM Ute is cheap, and that immediately gets your hackles up going, why is it so cheap? Why is this car so much more affordable than its rivals? But it turns out, the proof in the driving at least, is that the Ute is almost as good as its mainstream rivals, if not better than a few of them. And certainly that interior is more impressive to look at and more impressive to ride in than many established vehicles in this segment, which are gratuitously overpriced. The message that I want to send is that in the absence of cars like the Amarok V6 and high-spec Ford Rangers, which tend to be pretty impressive, and maybe cars like the Navara Warrior, which is sub-assembled here in Australia, most dual cab Utes are acceptable at best, and yet they're very expensive. So it's good to see a vehicle like the GWM Ute enter the market, which meets that bar, in some ways exceeds it, but it's priced to reflect that these vehicles are at their heart pretty simple, pretty agricultural workhorses, not luxury cars, not refined like SUVs. So for me, this makes a lot of sense. Let me know your thoughts down below. Is this a vehicle you'd take a punt on, or are you going to stick with something more established and better known? I'm keen to know your view, and you're welcome to disagree with me. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell, and don't forget the Chasing Cars newsletter and the free sticker. Thanks for watching Chasing Cars.